it's great to see so many people here interested in small brown birds in this weather. So thank you for coming. I'll try and make it entertaining. So I'm an ecologist at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, currently based in Wallingford, but I'm probably going to be moving to Lancaster next year. And I've been working in woodlands for about half of my life. So you can do the mathematics on that. I spent a lot of time doing research in British ancient woodlands with their bluebells, but also I spend quite a bit of time, a month each spring, in the primeval forest in Eastern Europe. So Biodiversity forest, if you've ever heard of that, in Eastern Poland. So that's kind of the original wildwood where there's wolves and bison, which makes a really nice comparison. So instead of seeing dog walkers and muntjac, I get to share the forest with wolves and bison. But it helps to show us where British woodlands probably started out. So the sort of thing, what they looked like before we started changing them over the centuries. But spending your career in ecology means that you get a front row seat in the biodiversity crisis. So it's pretty obvious to most people here that we're living through a mass extinction now caused by us. So we've changed most of the land and the climate and the oceans. We've moved species around, or we've hunted them or taken them as pets. So the extinction rate now is maybe 100 or 1,000 times above normal. So there's a few extinct species there, which you're probably familiar with. Thylacine, Bachman's warbler, passenger pigeon, used to be the most abundant bird in the world. And new on the list is slender-billed curlew. That was declared extinct only this month. And they used to exist around Europe, but we're never going to see them again. But extinctions begin with a big decline, and we can see these declines all around us. So in Europe, we've lost 600 million birds since the 1980s. And in Britain, we account for a big chunk of that. We've lost 73 million birds since 1970. And this includes lots of birds which were so common they were thought to be invincible. So skylarks, starlings, house sparrows, their numbers have crashed. Pretty much all bird groups are in decline across Europe, and farmland birds have seen the biggest losses, which is well documented due to agricultural intensification. But woodland birds are another group in big decline. But so far in across Europe, actually, the decline is quite shallow because there's lots more forests in Eastern Europe where the birds are doing quite well, and there's even signs of a recent recovery even across parts of the continent. But in Britain, it's much worse and it's much more complicated. So this is the UK index for woodland birds, and this is based on populations of 37 species monitored each year. Overall, there's been a big decline in numbers of the woodland bird index by 40% since 1970. That's the middle line there. Some woodland birds have done all right. Some have done very well, and these are the generalists. So that's the red line at the top. They've pretty much maintained their numbers. But it's the woodland specialists which we're really worried about. These are the ones in serious trouble. So they've had a 60% decline in this subgroup, and that's really dragging down the index because there's more specialists than generalists. So these are some of the increasing generalists that are doing pretty well. And these will be familiar to pretty much everyone. So blue tits, great tits, robins, wrens, and I'll come back to some of these later because we want to focus on the fantastic woodland specialists that we're losing very quickly. So some of these birds will also be very familiar, even to people who don't know much about birds. So nightingale, cuckoo, turtle dove, these are very familiar names. But these specialists, individual species, have declined by 80, 90, even 99% in our lifetime. So it can't really get much worse than that. Except, of course, it can. They can go extinct completely in Britain. And we've already lost some woodland birds from Britain, some stunning species. So wrynex, top left, small brown woodpecker, they last bred in 2002, and now they're all gone. Last golden orioles nested in 2009 in Suffolk, they're extinct as well. Capercaillies have gone extinct once, and it looks like they're going to go extinct again. So we lost them in the 1780s, they were reintroduced in the 19th century, but now there's only about 500 left, and they're predicted to go extinct unless there's some very serious drastic action in the next 20 years. So extinction in Britain is a very real prospect for quite a few woodland birds. But does any of this even matter? I mean, why should we care about woodland birds? Probably preaching to the choir here, but it's always worth thinking about how we talk about this to the wider public. Why should they spend public money on conserving species which they don't really know very well? Well, woodland in one form or another, it's a natural vegetation for much of Britain. It's where a lot of our nature comes from. And woodland birds are ingrained in our culture. So it's everywhere, from poetry to Christmas cards to bagpuss. So if you remember bagpuss from the 1980s, Professor Yaffle was a green woodpecker. He was a woodland bird. So apologies to anyone under 40 who doesn't know what the hell I'm talking about. Ask your parents about Professor Yaffle. Wah, wah, wah. And all of this matters, but it matters to me if you want to live in a place with life and diversity. So walking through a woodland with birds missing, to me, it's like walking down an empty high street where the pub's closed, the shops are closed, there's nothing there, no post office. Soul is completely gone. So it's just about, living in a nice place with nice things around you. There's also more practical reasons. There's plenty of studies now showing that connection to nature is good for our health. So hearing birdsong, seeing birds, walking in woodland, forest bathing, it reduces stress and anxiety in people. It makes people feel good. So that's another reason to try and keep this biodiversity around us. So what is going wrong in woodlands in Britain? Why are so many birds declining? Different species seem to have different problems. There's no simple answer. It's not like the 1960s with pesticides and birds of prey, where there was one silver bullet. If we ban the pesticides, the birds of prey will recover. It's much more complex than that. But these are some of the ideas which have been floated over the past couple of decades for what might be going wrong in woodlands. So most woodland hasn't been managed for about 100 years. That's been suggested as a problem, and it probably is for some species. For others, it might be an opportunity. Increasing numbers of deer might be damaging woodland vegetation by eating all of the understory. That's been a big suggestion. There's been lots of research into that, lots of interest into it anyway. There's more deer now than there have been for about the past 1,000 years. They don't have any natural predators, not many anyway, apart from us and cars. There's also been increases in invasive species and some predators, and people talk a lot about grey squirrels. They're worried that they're eating lots of birds' eggs. And the problems might not even be in Britain for some of these species. So the long distance migrants like wood warblers, they have to deal with any problems on migration, traveling through Europe, across the Sahara and into Central Africa. So that can complicate things. Their problems might not even be here. And then there's climate change, which affects everything, but maybe in subtle and indirect ways. So shifting seasons, summer droughts, torrential spring rains, warmer winters. These could all be affecting woodland birds in different ways. And it is important to say that there is not enough research on most of this, and we still don't really know which factors are most important for many species, or in what combination, and then maybe they vary over space and time. So I'm going to focus on two species for which we do have some good studies, and this can maybe help show us what's going wrong, at least for these woodland birds, just to help us break into this mystery to see what's going on. So this is a pair of closely related species, the Marsh Tit and the Willow Tit. And they're both in very serious trouble in Britain. So Marsh Tits have declined by 81% since the 1970s. And Willow Tits are a strong contender for one of the next extinctions in Britain. There's only 3% of them left. And this is how much they've gone from their original range. So before deforestation, so after the last ice age, woodland would have covered much of Britain, and Marsh Tits and Willow Tits would have been in pretty much all of it. But they're now almost extinct in Scotland, both of them. And in the last 40 years, Willow Tits have disappeared from most of southern Britain too. So that's Willow Tit on the right. If I was stood here 20 years ago, Willow Tits would be all the way down to Kent, but now they've contracted almost completely. And they're increasingly becoming sort of a northern bird or a Welsh bird as well. And these losses of range and abundance, they're not stopping, they're continuing, and they're even accelerating. So Willow Tits are going extinct at the rate of about 7% per year. Marsh Tits about 3%. But what are Marsh Tits and Willow Tits anyway? Are they just brown versions of familiar blue tits? Maybe these are birds that we can help with nest boxes and bird feeders, just like blue tits. Actually, marsh tits and willow tits are very different from blue tits and great tits, and they're not very closely related to them. So they're part of a big set of about 15 species in the Quietening genus. And this is the chickadees and the black cap tits of Europe and Asia. So this group of species that circle the northern forest around the northern hemisphere, and these different species in different areas. But they've all got a really familiar, similar template, which is evident from these pictures. So they've got a black and white head and a brownish body. They're all woodland birds. So despite the marsh tit's name, it is a woodland bird. They generally have big territories. They pair for life, and they stay in the same territory pretty much for their entire life. So crucially, and very different from blue tits or great tits, all of these Quietening species store food in autumn and winter. So they hide tens of thousands of seeds in their home ranges, which explains why they don't really leave them. So they're playing the long game. They invest everything in their patch of woodland, and they're quite adapted to tough environments. So some of these species live in the boreal forests, and they live there all the way through the winter. So for 25 years, I've been doing a long-term study of marsh tits, and I've been looking at their territories, how much habitat they need, their breeding success, how many chicks they rear, how their movements might be affected by habitat fragmentation, and what their survival rates look like. And the idea was, if we can understand this, then we'll have a pretty good idea of what's driving the decline of marsh tits and what isn't. So this is my study area. I'm centred on Monkswood in Cambridgeshire, in eastern England. It's just off the A1, sandwiched between the A1 and the Great North East Railway, between Huntingdon and Peterborough. So if you're ever driving or getting the train north out of London to York, you're going to pass right through it, and you'll see Monkswood on just out the window. So at the peak in about 15 years ago, I was monitoring 16 of these scattered woods in the area, which had up to 90 marsh tit territories in them. So this is the red outlines. But more recently, it's just been focusing on Monkswood and its immediate neighbours. So Monkswood, some of you may have heard of it. We used to have a big research station there, which is closed about 15 years ago. So it's a big ancient woodland. It's one of the most important lowland woods in the country. It's very famous for its beetles and butterflies, especially black hair streaks and white admirals. So Monkswood, like pretty much all other woodland in Britain, it was managed for coppicing, intensively managed for centuries, but most of that management stopped just over a century ago. So it's been maturing ever since, and it's been reverting back to natural woodland, really, self-willed woodland, or rewilding, if you like. So to study the population, first we have to catch all the marsh tits. And I was doing this with a network of traps around the wood to try and catch the birds in every territory. So it wasn't just one or two ringing locations. I was actually going to every territory trying to catch the marsh tits in there. So the marsh tits are all colouring on their legs with a different colour combination for each bird, so we can tell them apart when we see them again. And I do this every year. So every autumn is the trapping season, and it acts like a census for the whole population, showing who is alive, who is dead, where they are, and their age and their sex and their biometrics. Quite a few of them are also ringed as chicks. And to do this, I have to find the nests, which are in holes in trees. And then I have to get the chicks out of these nests in holes in trees to ring them and then put them back in again. So it's very labor intensive, which explains why I don't do much of it anymore. But this is really important, as it means that we can follow them throughout their entire life. So we know exactly where they came from. We know how many of them survived. We know where their brothers and sisters are, and their parents and their relatives. So once we've colouring the whole population, we can start to get to know the different individuals and what they do. So using the different colouring combinations, we can monitor a bird's life whenever we see it again in the wood. And over the course of the study, we've ringed about 1,700 marsh tits during the project. I was out doing it last weekend. Last weekend was the final session for this year. And at any one time, there's about 50 to 100 alive in the wood. So at any one time, we're monitoring between 50 and 100 individuals. So we can see who is breeding together, how they interact with their neighbours, and where they go. So by looking for the birds in spring and plotting the observations of different individuals, we can start to map the territory locations to give us a handle on how much woodland they need. So each of these little clusters of colours on the left, this is a sighting of a different marsh tit. And you can see the sightings are very clustered. Each bird sticks to a certain area. It's not roaming all over the wood. And this is just a small selection, just so you can see some individual clusters. But if we draw an outline around these clusters, we can see the territory boundaries. So this is how they're spacing themselves in the available habitat. Also tells us the population size and the density. So how many pairs of marsh tits are in the wood. So on the right is all of the territories for monkswood in 1 year. I think it was 2007 that year. And I've done this every year for the past 24 years. And these results show that they need a lot of space. So the territories average about 5 or 6 hectares, which is quite a lot for a small bird. So you can probably fit about 5 or 10 pairs of blue tits in an average marsh tit territory. And the territories are so big because they're living in them all year round. So they have to contain enough resources to support them, so their partner and their family in the spring for the entire year. But by having big territories, that also means that they keep out other marsh tits to reduce the competition. But it also means that they're limiting their own population. So you can only fit so many marsh tits in a wood because it's limited by this territory size. You can't physically squeeze any more in. So mapping the territories helps us to find the nests because it narrows down the search. We know which pair is hanging around in which area. So if we follow the colouring adults, they eventually will lead us to the nests. And this involves lots of field work. You can imagine trying to follow marsh tits through a wood, trying to see the colourings on them to identify the individuals, and then looking which tree hole they're going into in a wood full of tree holes. So marsh tits breed about once per year, and it's in a small hole, almost always in a living tree, because they're safer than dead trees that have a harder wood. And the nest can be anywhere from ground level up to 20 meters high. And we can monitor the nest with endoscopes to look inside. And this tells us the breeding success. So over the course of the study, over all of the years, we found that the breeding success is actually pretty good. So about 80% of nests produce chicks. So only 1 in 5 nests fail. And that's the same also if you look at the national data. So the National Nest Record Scheme for BTO members, casual records, that's also about 80% nest success. And these are pretty good numbers. You know, these are not bad. Unlike blue tits, marsh tits will rarely use nest boxes. And this is because if you think about it, they have such big territories, they've got a lot of tree holes to choose from. So the chances of a nest box being exactly where they want it is pretty remote. And they probably also prefer the protection of a hole in living wood, which has harder walls. It's also got a more humid microclimate than nest boxes too. That might be important to them. So the important take-home message from this, we did try and get marsh tits into nest boxes just for ease of study, but we found that they weren't interested. So nest boxes don't help marsh tits. They're not a conservation tool for them because they're limited by these big territory sizes, not by nest sites. So it doesn't matter how many nest boxes you put in there, you are not going to increase the marsh tit population. What you will do is increase the blue tit population because they will pack each other in, they will pack themselves in. Blue tits and great tits, they are limited by good nest sites because they can have much smaller territories. So nest boxes can be counterproductive because it can increase the numbers of the other tits. But when marsh tits do use nest boxes, occasionally, it makes it easier for us to get nice pictures like this. So once we know where the territories and nests are, we can look at the habitat to see if marsh tits are being selective. So in the olden days, we would do this by going into the wood or sending students into the wood and measuring trees in a sample plot. So the problem with this, as you can imagine, is that if you're stuck on the ground and trying to look upwards and characterize a woodland, wood's a very three-dimensional habitat. It's like trying to map a cathedral by only being stood on the ground. Most of the action and the vegetation is above your head. It's also a very, very complex environment, so you're only ever going to measure just a little bit of it. So the answer to all of this is to use new technology, which we started doing. We were some of the pioneers of using these aerial surveys to map woodland habitats for woodland birds. So the idea is to get above the woodland and looking down rather than on the ground looking up. And we started doing this with aircraft, but now we can do it with drones because they can carry heavier payloads. And this way we can survey entire woods in 3D, not just little sample plots. And this is how it works. So the method is called LiDAR, which you might have heard of, especially if you watch archaeology programs. They're always using LiDAR to map the lumps and bumps on the ground. And it uses a laser scanner to map everything on the ground in very great detail. So by recording how long it takes the laser to bounce back from the ground or from trees, from any surface, it can work out the heights, the features in massive detail. Same as a speed camera, really, or a speed gun. Fires a laser and counts how long it takes to come back. But it means you can map woodlands and penetrate the woodland vegetation down to a few centimeters. So you can map trees and woodlands on a scale of a few centimeters. So this is the LiDAR for the study area, for the Monkswood study area. Monkswood is in the middle there, the big wood. So the blue color is the ground, and the redder color is the taller trees. So the redder the color, the taller the trees. And this is colored deliberately because what you can see immediately from this is how the woods look like islands in a sea of farmland. So this is because British woodland is massively fragmented. So once this would have been continuous woodland, but we've deforested most of the landscape. So all that is left is these little fragments, and they have very hard edges, and there's very little connectivity between them. And that really matters for marsh tits because they're basically living in isolated islands of habitat. But for the habitat analyses, the LiDAR lets us overlay the marsh tit territories onto the LiDAR. So we can look at the total vegetation inside and outside of each territory. So we can look at things like the average tree height, vegetation density, height complexity, because the LiDAR gives us complete coverage of the vegetation inside and outside of the territories. Just on this example again, so this is the 2007 territories, you can see that they're generally putting them in the taller, redder bits of the wood. So they're more or less avoiding the kind of bluish stuff through the middle of the wood, which is shorter woodland vegetation. So they're going for the taller bits. So when we did the analysis, looking at multiple years, multiple territories, lots of LiDAR data, we got a very good idea of what marsh tits want from woodland. So they're avoiding young woodland. So the stuff on the left, which is young shrubby woodland without a tree canopy, marsh tits generally wait until woodland is at least 50 years old before they can use it. They also avoided mature woodland, like the stuff on the right, if it didn't have an understory shrub layer. So like in managed plantations. I don't know what's happened to the font there. The font has changed. So managed plantations, which have lots of dense mature trees, but little understory, little shrub layer underneath, they avoid that too. And what they're going for is the stuff in the middle. So multi-layered woodland structure. So it's got a good shrub layer and a mature tree canopy above it. The more complex and mature, the more that the marsh tits liked it. And this reflects kind of old growth woodland, ancient woodland, unmanaged woodland. That's the sort of thing. So this is what it looks like. This is some examples of marsh tit territories in some of the unmanaged ancient woodland. So it's old, it's unmanaged, it's diverse, it's got multiple layers of vegetation. You can't see very far through it, which is a good rule of thumb. It's got a good shrub layer, so things like hazel, hawthorn, dogwood. Tall tree canopy above it, oak, aspen, ash, maple, lots of climbers like honeysuckle, lots of standing deadwood, dead trees. Marsh tits aren't really that bothered about what the composition is, as long as there's a lot of variety of trees. So they're not an oak specialist, they're not an ash specialist or a hawthorn specialist. They want a bit of everything because that gives them lots of opportunities. So this structure and this diversity gives marsh tits lots of niches and food sources throughout the year, remembering they're living in their big territories and they need everything in that territory to support them throughout the year. So they want lots of variety, lots of variation, different food sources coming on stream at different times of the year. So this is the sort of woodland habitat marsh tits avoided. Sometimes get them in these habitats, but it's not their preference. So woodland that is mature, but it's too open. So woodland at the top, you can see right through it. So you can see about 80 meters through that woodland. So there's no understory shrub layer. Also heavily managed woodland, so bottom left. This is where the understory has been removed by coppicing. So that destroys part of the territory. I mean, yes, coppicing removes woodland, the vegetation for a bit, and it does grow back, but the marsh tits are resident in that territory. So if you've removed a third of their territory by coppicing, what are they supposed to do? They can't just go on holiday and wait for 3 years until it grows back. So that's not great for them either. They also avoid conifer plantations, which are dense monocultures mostly. There's not enough diversity of structure or species in there. So there's not enough to support them throughout the year. So the key thing about the woodland habitat for marsh tits is mature structure and diversity. Also wood that's big enough to hold enough of these territories for a population and support them all year round. So colour ringing also lets us look at movements by seeing how much the marsh tits move around. And generally they're settled for life. So not long after leaving the nest, the juvenile marsh tits disperse from their parents' territory and they immediately try and find somewhere to live, try and find their own territory. And they pretty much stay there until they die. And that could be 10 years later. So this is a couple of marsh tits in the study. And these lived in their territories for 9 or 10 years. Actually, the bird on the bottom left, that bird was hatched in 2015. So David Cameron was Prime Minister, Barack Obama was in the White House, Britain was in the EU, and I saw him 2 weeks ago. He's still there. Yeah, but anyway, Barack Obama's still there. But finding their own territory and dispersing is where the problems lie. So juvenile dispersal is the most challenging time of a marsh tit's life. And they've got to do this when they're only 5 weeks old. So just a fortnight after leaving the nest, only 5 weeks since they were an egg, and they've got to make this massive journey. So that's when they leave their parents' territory and find their own place to live. And I apologize about the font there. Some of the fonts on these comments have gone weird. So this map, this shows the movements of juvenile marsh tits in our study area between, these are birds which moved from the wood in which they were born to another wood where they're settled after dispersal. And these are just the ones which are successful. So we don't know how many of them weren't successful. But what you can see from this is that most of the lines are only between neighboring woods. So very few of them go between distant woods. And this shows that the juvenile marsh tits are finding it really difficult to disperse across these gaps in the farmland to find other woodlands. So the woodland is too fragmented and these big gaps between the patches of habitat. Remember that these birds don't have a map. They don't know where they're going. So they might come to the edge of a wood and they might be able to see another woodland, but they can't get there because they won't just fly up and over a field because they're too scared. They want to be inside cover. So sometimes they will follow hedgerows, and some of these individuals have been found out in the fens because they follow a hedgerow and they end up in the middle of the fens and there's no woodland there. So they basically keep going and die trying, or they will get lost, or they'll have an accident, or they'll meet with a predator. Some of them have been found dead at the roadside when they've been trying to find new woods. So remember that this woodland was not always like this. This landscape was once forested and the marsh tits could move in any direction without breaking cover, keeping into tight woodland to find where the vacant territories are. But now they have this added problem of trying to cross the barriers and find woodlands where they don't know where they are. So what marsh tits need? Big old woodlands, not heavily managed, lots of woodland nearby, lots of good connectivity, so they can move around easily and find each other to form new pairs. And this makes marsh tits a very good indicator of ancient woodland. So despite the name, we should call them the forest tit or the woodland tit because they're a woodland indicator species, the same way we think about bluebells or hazel dormice. Marsh tits are a really good indicator of good ancient woodland. But when thinking about the declines of woodland birds like marsh tits, we tend to focus on the state of today's woodland and what is left of it. So we often forget that in the middle of the last century, between the 50s and the 80s, about 1/3 of our ancient woodland was destroyed because it was turned into conifer plantation. This was official policy. And this must have been devastating for many species because the foresters often focused on the larger woodlands. So the best habitat for marsh tits, the big ancient woodlands, were the ones which they converted to conifer plantations because they were the most economically profitable. So we've done some analysis recently. We have a paper in preparation, and we've estimated that these conifer plantations in some of our best woods probably destroyed about 25,000 marsh tit territories by the 80s. And at the time, that was probably about 1 in 5 of the population. The current population estimate for marsh tits is 28,000 pairs. So it's almost equal to destroying the current population. And we think that probably had a lot to do with their decline over the past 50 years, because it would have destabilized and fragmented the population even more than it already was. But in conservation, we mostly forget about that destruction because not many people were studying it. There's very little literature on the effects of this. We tend to focus on the woodland that is left, and has it been changing in a good or a bad way? And ironically for marsh tits, it's probably been improving. So the native woodland that we've got left has been expanding. It's also maturing. Because it hasn't been managed or logged for the past 100 years, it's got away. So it's become a bit wilder, and that's what marsh tits seem to like. The problem is it's just so scattered in small fragments. There's been lots of worry about increasing deer damaging woodland, and this does happen in some places. So there are parts of the country where there is lots of invasive fallow deer or muntjac, and these cause carnage, basically. It's like having a flock of sheep in a wood. But the idea that deer are wiping out the understory on a massive scale doesn't seem to be happening. The data doesn't support that. So this table shows the change in woodland understory. So this woodland shrub layer, so stuff from your knee up to about 4, 5, 6 meters high. And this is the change in England and Wales between the 1980s and 2004. So it's from a big study of 249 woods by RSPB and BTO, the Repeat Woodland Bird Survey. And what you can see from that table, basically, so the red arrows are where the understory's gone down, and the green are where understory's got denser, and the black is where there's been not much change in those 25 years. And almost everywhere, the understory density, it's actually increased or been stable. So the understory density of woodland is not being wiped out by deer. So deer are not really a big problem for the shrub layer, at least for marsh tits. But we found some big clues in the survival rates at Monkswood. So for adults on the left, so the annual survival is pretty good and it's fairly stable. About 50% of the adults are alive from 1 year to the next. So about half of them survive. And this is what you would expect from populations of other Poikile species in other parts of the world. This is standard. But for juveniles on the right, this is where we're seeing a big slump in recruitment over the past 15 years. And remember that the breeding success, which we looked at, is good. So it's not that there's fewer young being produced. The slump means that the juvenile survival is dropping in their early months of life. And this is when they're trying to disperse and settle in their own territories. So that's where something's happening to them. And it's this slump in the survival of juveniles in their recruitment. This is what's driving the population decline at Monkswood in our study area and probably more widely. So it was stable at first, which is the blue bit, when we started the study. But since about 2010, it's got very volatile, very unstable, but strongly downwards. So the bad years get worse, and the good years never take us back to where we were. So they never recover. And one of the interesting things is they have good years and bad years on this downward decline, but they never have 2 good years in a row. So when they go up, the next year, they're always going to go down. And eventually, this is just dragging down the population total. So now we've got about half the population what we had when I started. So apart from the problems with dispersal, marsh tits are also having to deal with more competition in woodlands. So numbers of blue tits and great tits have increased a lot, while the marsh tits have been declining. There are some recent declines there for the blue tits and great tits too, and this is thought to be due to some recent bad springs, so some wet springs when they've got chicks. But overall, it's a big increase in these populations. And every one of these extra blue tits and great tits in the woods is dominant to every single marsh tit, because marsh tits are subordinate species to these. So even the lowest blue tit is dominant over the strongest marsh tit. And they forage in many of the same places, so woodlands and trees and shrubs. They eat a lot of the same foods. So more of these species means there's more dominant competition for marsh tits to cope with. And there's now some good evidence that these competition effects are real. So marsh tits actively avoid big groups of blue tits and great tits. So they're actually being displaced. When you have lots of blue tits and great tits in a wood, the marsh tits avoid them, so they're avoiding good areas. And this is probably because of dominance. So they get hassled, they get chased, they get robbed of any food that they find. And it's very difficult to study competition. So all you can do is kind of look at patterns, but this is probably having an effect. A subtle pressure that's been increasing, and the marsh tits can't seem to get away from it. So I've been talking about marsh tits for quite a while. What can we say about their decline? Well, what we can say, it's complicated, really complicated. So there's multiple problems, and they're just the ones that we can think about. They're just the ones that we understand to some extent. We know there's been a big loss of some of the best habitat in the middle of the last century due to conifer plantations, and that's further fragmented the good habitat that was left. We know that competition has increased a lot, and marsh tits probably try to avoid that. So the landscape has become more hostile for them. And the big problem seems to be with these juveniles. They're finding it harder to disperse, get across the landscape, and survive when they get there. So the normal adult mortality is not being replaced by new juveniles, and that's driving the decline in the study area. So if you thought it was bad for marsh tits, let's talk a bit about willow tits. We might not have the will to live by the time we finish this. So this is a bird which is common and widespread when I was a kid. I used to have them in the garden in Hull. When I started at Monkswood, there was willow tits there still, but they're very likely to go extinct during my lifetime. So they've gone from a common garden bird for me to probably extinct before I put my clogs. And willow tits have a lot of the same problems as marsh tits, but also some more intense problems. So ironically, willow tits are actually less specialized than marsh tits when it comes to habitat. They're actually less picky. So they used to be found in a wide range of woody habitats, everything from wet woodland to heaths, tall hedges, wooded lanes, ancient woodland, even conifer plantations. These were all willow tit habitats. And these pictures are all from willow tit territories, just in about in the past 20 years. But increasingly, they're being restricted in Britain to young woodland and shrubby habitats, especially on these brownfield sites in northern England. And these are habitats that are quite poor woodland for other tits. So it's suboptimal habitat for things like blue tits. And this is maybe a bit of a clue. So it looks like willow tits are being squeezed out of good habitats where they used to do quite well, and they're increasingly restricted to these suboptimal habitats. So there's been some similar colour ringing and territory studies, like with marsh tits. And this is a map of estimated willow tit territories on the edge of Wigan, so northwest England, former coal mining area, lots of subsidence. It's now National Nature Reserve, country parks. So these territory estimates are based on the nest sites, which are the black dots. These are Thiessen polygons, so it's just geometric shapes to try and estimate the territory sizes around all of the known nest sites. And if you look at the scale bar at the bottom, 500 meters, and the density of the housing, which is the grey shading around, then the territories are also very big, just like marsh tits. So willow tits also need a lot of habitat to maintain pairs and populations. It's no good just having one good willow tit habitat, you need a lot of it to maintain a population so that the juveniles can support each other and replace the adults that are dying. So willow tits are slightly unusual. If you know one thing about willow tits, it's that they excavate their own nest hole each year, unlike the other tits. And this should give them an advantage in all types of woodland because then they can exploit a wide range of woody habitats. They need deadwood for this, but deadwood is actually not a problem in Britain these days because there's virtually no management removing it. So nest site availability is not a problem. But it does take them a couple of weeks usually to dig a nest. So if they lose it, it can really set them back. And again, they breed just once a year. But what the nest studies show of willow tits in Britain is that British willow tits have really high nest losses. So at least half of the nests fail. And this is more than double the losses of willow tits that you see in Northern Europe, in the boreal zone, and also it's more than double what you see from the marsh tits. So this is probably unsustainable, and it's probably one of the drivers of their decline. They're just losing so many nests are being destroyed. And one of the main reasons is blue tits. So I'm really down on blue tits in this talk. I'm sorry for anyone who likes blue tits. But blue tits take over willow tit nests. They are the biggest nest competitor. Remember that blue tits are dominant to willow tits. So they just wait for them for a couple of weeks to dig their nest, and then they just take it over and breed in it themselves. And this wipes out a quarter of the willow tit nests, much higher than anywhere else. Second reason is that those nests that do avoid the blue tits then get attacked by great spotted woodpeckers, which eat the chicks, and they destroy another quarter of willow tit nests. And there's like a timeline along the bottom there of the despicable things that woodpeckers do to willow tits. So they will find a willow tit nest in some dead birch or something with chicks in it. They will dig a new hole underneath the nest hole at the level of the nest, and then they'll pull out the chicks, and they wedge them into a little crevice as if they're a nut, and then they peck them to pummel them to break them apart, and then they feed into their own young. And they do this to about a quarter of willow tit nests. So that's why willow tit nest losses are so high, unusually high in Britain. It's because of blue tits and woodpeckers. And we've mentioned earlier that blue tits have been increasing, but so have woodpeckers by phenomenal rates. So they've increased by nearly 400% in the period when willow tits have been declining. This all means that willow tits are finding it increasingly difficult to get away from their competitors and their predators. So blue tits and great spotted woodpeckers, they're common almost everywhere now, in every woody habitat, spilling over into any patch of woodland, and there aren't many places that willow tits can avoid them now. So on top of these really high nest losses, willow tits have probably got the same problems as marsh tits, or some of them. So fragmented habitat, difficulty dispersing. They've got the same lifestyle, so the same dispersal limitations. Probably increased competition for foraging space from more dominant species. So the landscape has become much more hostile inside and outside of woodlands, and this is pushing willow tits out of many places. So that's all very depressing. What can we do about any of it? Are there any rays of hope? Remember, these are just two of the declining woodland birds. There's a whole lot more, and these are just the things that we know about. So the problems they're facing are complex, and they seem really big and intractable. One thing we can do is to think about our own roles in this as individuals, as people. We tend to do a lot of big favours for the dominant species and predators, like blue tits and great spotted woodpeckers. To be fair, we've been told that this is a good thing for about the past 40 years. Buy bird food, put up bird feeders, the more the better. Adverts in every bird magazine, adverts on TV, feed the birds, feed them all year round, feed them in our gardens. Give them nest boxes to breed in. All of this creates a paradise for blue tits. So we're feeding blue tits and great spotted woodpeckers all year round. We're giving blue tits millions, literally millions of good nest sites to breed in. And bird feeding is a massive business. £400 million a year, but it's also a massive input and a massive experiment that benefits some species, probably at the expense of the subdominant species. So the species which don't benefit from nest boxes and bird feeders, like marsh tits, willow tits, they're the ones bearing the brunt of this boom in blue tits and woodpeckers. And this feeding effect, as well as other things, it's so big that it's changing woodland bird communities. So blue tits and great spotted woodpeckers, they're super abundant in British woods, far above natural baselines. If you go to the Biodiversity forest in eastern Poland, the original wildwood with the bison and the wolves and everything else, marsh tits and willow tits there too, but you won't see as many blue tits. Blue tits, you can go whole days without seeing blue tits. Great spotted woodpeckers, plenty of them too, but the pine martins eat quite a lot of them, so they've got their own problems. So there's almost nowhere in Britain where willow tits and marsh tits can get away from their predators and competitors because we've created a paradise for them. Something else we can do is to think about native woodlands as habitats, natural habitats, rather than resources to be managed or exploited. So if we expand and rewild all kinds of native woodland, we'll get more resilient landscapes and more options for woodland birds to exist. There'll be more niches for all of these woodland species. And there are policies to restore ancient woodland by removing plantations, also to increase woodland cover. But we're not really meeting the targets, and we could be a lot more ambitious. It's not happening quickly enough. And then the elephant in the room, all of this is overshadowed by climate change, of course, which is affecting everything. So we're now looking at 2 degrees of warming, probably by 2050. Who knows where it's going to stop? Warmer winters that we've had so far, they also favour the generalists. So blue tits, they're a southern adapted species. They've got better survival in warmer winters. So whereas the willow tits and the crafty marsh tits storing their seeds to give them an edge during the frosty, cold, snowy months, that edge no longer exists. There are no cold winter months, and the blue tits don't get any checks in their populations. Summer droughts are also stressing woodland habitats. We've got new diseases, ash dieback, acute oak decline. This is probably reducing food supplies too. None of this is good for northern adapted birds like willow tits or marsh tits. So this is something we should maybe be planning for in conservation, thinking about restoring woodland ecosystems in the north to give these species a chance of surviving climate change. So higher altitudes, more northern latitudes, restoring large forests, maybe that will give some of these species a chance. So again, marsh tits and willow tits, they are just two of these sweet declining species. As you saw earlier, there's many more. And again, this is not even all of them, you know, there's dozens of declining woodland species. And we urgently need more research. If there's one message I can get across to you, it's that we just don't know enough at the moment. We don't know enough to fully understand the declines of these different woodland species. But if we can try and find some common themes, then we can maybe direct some action. But for some of these woodland birds, I do worry that it's getting too late already. It's very close to midnight for some of them. And I think we're going to see more extinctions in the future. So that's almost it. I will leave you with a plug. There is a book. So if you want to know more about marsh tits and willow tits and their habitats, I talk a lot in this poison monograph by Bloomsbury. I talk a lot about their ecology and all of these issues in much more detail. So that's it. Thanks for listening.